I've spoken before on this channel about libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism. The idea that the government should have as little coercive power over the people as possible or as practical, or none at all, as a lot of extreme libertarians or anarcho-capitalists would have it. But in this video I want to talk about the idea of freedom a little bit more broadly, not just talking about the freedoms that the government either is infringing on or allowing us to have, but freedom more broadly as a personal philosophy. What does it mean to have a free life? To me, a truly free life would be a life with no obligations. And even in the Ancapistan, which is to say a theoretical state where there is no government at all and everything is run by capitalist companies and businesses, even if there were no government at all, we'd still have legal obligations. I mean, that's kind of the idea of how Ancapistan works. We would all enter voluntarily into contracts with businesses and with each other in order to perform the functions that the government currently performs. So I suppose my question is, if you voluntarily enter into a contract, is that giving up some of your freedom, or are you still exercising your freedom because you chose the terms of this contract and you decided for yourself that this was the right thing for you? A lot of people compare being in debt to a kind of servitude, to being a slave, since your earnings are not your own property, they belong to your debtor, or is the debtor the person who takes out the debt? What's the name of the person who gives you the debt? The lender. You're indebted to the lender. Some people say that you are a kind of slave to them because your earnings do not belong to you, they belong to the lender. When you look at what we might call a typical life, the life of someone who is married, they have a mortgage or a rent payment, they have a full-time job probably, and most people are not self-employed, so they probably enter into a contract to do that job, whether it's permanent or temporary. For 8 hours a day, for 5 days a week, for most weeks in the year, your life is not your own, in the sense that you are fulfilling your obligation to these contracts that you've entered into. So you need to go to work because you have a contract with your employer, and you need to have a job because you need to pay your mortgage or the rent. If you have children, then there's a legal obligation for you to take care of them if you're able to do so, either directly by keeping them in your house and feeding them, or through childcare payments if you don't live with them. So my question is this a free life or is it not? It completely depends on how you want to define free or freedom. On the other end of the spectrum, someone with absolutely no obligations might be a child. It's the responsibility of their parents and their guardians to take care of them, to pay for everything, and to make sure they have an education and that they stay safe. But the flip side of that is that the child has absolutely no legal autonomy. Nothing they do is their own choice, and their guardians have the complete rule over their decisions. So perhaps the freest person I can think of would be an adult who still lives with their parent as if they're a child. They have all of the freedom of a child with no obligations, they have no rent to pay, they have no responsibility for feeding themselves, they let their parents take care of them completely. They have all the legal autonomy of an adult with all of the freedom of a child. But despite this being perhaps the freest way of living, I don't think it's the best way of living. Of course, I leave it up to your own discretion whether or not you agree or disagree with that. Obviously, I'm biased in that I obviously am going to approve of my own life decisions, and I have an incentive to believe that what I have done with my life is the best way of living. I've also been thinking about freedom and how it relates to our own impulses. Someone who's addicted to heroin could technically be free in the sense that they have no obligations, they have no rent or mortgage, or they have no legal contracts to fulfill, and yet they are a slave to their own impulses. They might spend any money that they can get their hands on feeding their addiction. And although we can call that a choice, because they technically have the choice of doing anything with that money, to say that that person is free is not exactly accurate. I don't know if this is just my own personal phobia, but I find the idea of being addicted to a substance like that very frightening. The idea that you wouldn't be able to have control over your own self, and that there's something else working within your body that is not your own mind. something that rules over all of your decisions like that. In some ways, I sometimes think I'd rather be in prison or to be a slave than to be addicted to a substance like that. Obviously, it would depend on the situation, what kind of slave, or, in what prison am I going to be in. Coming back to this idea of obligations that we choose to take on voluntarily, I think about the part of the Odyssey where Odysseus, or Ulysses, or Jason, depending on what source you're reading from, he wants to hear the siren song. It is known that the siren song is so beautiful that sailors will crash their boats upon the rocks trying to get to the sirens who are singing this beautiful song. And Odysseus comes up with a clever plan so that he can hear the song without dying, and he asks all of his crewmen to put wax in their ears so they can't hear. But he asks them to not put wax in his ears, but to tie him to the mast of the ship so that he can hear it, but will have no power to dash himself on the rocks trying to get to the sirens. So Odysseus has removed his freedom. He's tied himself to the mast to remove his freedom because he knows at some point in the future he is going to do something unwise. I think about this story a lot, and it kind of reminds me of, a junkie checking themselves into rehab because they know that they want to get clean, but they know that they can't do it on their own, and then they need somebody to force them to get clean. As a more cynical view, I think it kind of reminds me of marriage, right? The idea that that a man can tie himself to one woman and make it much more difficult for him to pursue other women in the future. So that's all I have to say for now on the subject of freedom. As always, please leave your comments about what you think about freedom or what you think of what I've said. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.